Early in 1945, a German prisoner named Karl Hans Friedrich was finishing a work assignment on a small farm in Arizona. The farmer asked the prisoners what they wanted for their last meal before they left. Every man gave him the same answer: chicken and ice cream, and that is what the farmer served them. It was a generous farewell, and Karl Hans remembered it for the rest of his life. But it was not the meal German prisoners received every day. Most days began with a metal cup, a piece of bread, perhaps cereal or fruit, and coffee from a large urn. Later there might be potatoes, cabbage, soup, sausage, or a modest portion of meat. I am Samuel Hartman. My father was one of the German prisoners brought to America. His captivity became part of our family history, and food has always been one of the first things people ask about. Did the prisoners really eat better than American families? Did they arrive hungry and find themselves surrounded by abundance? Or is that one of those wartime stories that grew larger each time it was repeated? Let me take you back to those mess halls. Before we are finished, I will show you one full day of food from an American camp in the spring of 1945. It may surprise you, but perhaps not for the reason you expect. Because the food behind that wire was never one simple story. More than 400,000 enemy prisoners crossed the ocean to the United States during the war. Most were German. Some lived in compounds holding thousands of men, while others were sent to a few barracks beside a farm, a factory, or a stretch of timberland. Every one of those men had to be fed. By the time my father reached America, the camp kitchens were working under a clear promise. German prisoners were to be fed on the same scale as American troops stationed at home. They were not promised anything grand, but they were not to be handed scraps. There were practical reasons for that. America wanted its own captured sons treated decently overseas. Camp commanders needed healthy men who could work, and a hungry compound soon became a sick and angry one. So flour arrived in sacks, milk came in bottles, coffee boiled in metal urns, and meat, potatoes, vegetables, and bread moved through army kitchens built to feed hundreds of men at a time. From inside the camp, that meant regular meals. From outside the fence, it could look very different. American families were saving sugar, meat, and butter. They were planting victory gardens and learning to make less go farther. Then they heard that German prisoners were eating food drawn from the Army's own supply. That anger would eventually change what appeared on the prisoners' trays. Before it did, the kitchens faced another problem. The Germans did not always understand the food America gave them. At Camp Fabens in Texas, one German prisoner looked at canned sweet corn and treated it as though it were feed for cattle. He knew what corn was. What he did not know was why an American cook had put a spoonful of the sweet yellow kernels beside the rest of his meal. That little serving of corn tells us more than a long list of regulations ever could. The food was American, and the men eating it were not. Peanut butter puzzled many prisoners. Some American soups went untouched. Frozen fruit, cornmeal, canned vegetables, and unfamiliar breakfast combinations were scraped from trays even when the men had been given enough to eat. At one Texas camp, prisoners gained between 4 and 12 pounds over the course of a year. That is difficult to fit beside the picture of starving men behind wire. Yet the extra weight did not mean every meal was enjoyed, and it certainly did not mean every camp was the same. At Papago Park in Arizona, German Navy prisoner Heinrich Palmer remembered food arriving at the compounds by truck. The ingredients were handed over and prisoner cooks prepared the meals themselves. Fresh milk came in bottles with cream at the top. The cook saved that cream, a little at a time, And when a man had a birthday, it became a small cake shared with a few friends. The prisoners joked that they had reached the land of milk and honey. You can understand why that story survived. A birthday cake inside a prison camp is the sort of thing a man remembers. Still, most mornings did not begin with cake, just as the final farm lunch of chicken and ice cream was not an ordinary ration. The everyday meal was quieter. Bread, coffee, potatoes, cabbage, cereal, cold meat, and whatever the kitchen could make from that week's delivery. And when too much of that food came back uneaten, the mess halls began to change. By the summer of 1944, the kitchens were paying close attention to what remained on the trays. Menus were posted, portions were controlled, and in some mess halls a man could not return for seconds until he had eaten what was already in front of him. The cooks learned which foods disappeared and which ones came back. One German submariner at Papago Park remembered the daily rhythm clearly. The men rose at 6. Roll call came before breakfast, and then the work teams gathered at the main gate. Trucks carried them out to farms and other assignments. In the evening, the guards searched them when they returned. Another count was taken, and only then did they go to dinner. That was the world my father belonged to. Counts, work trucks, fixed meal hours, and the same gate at the beginning and end of every day. A prisoner learned to measure time differently. Morning was the cup of coffee after roll call. Midday was whatever waited when the work stopped. Evening was the meal after the search and the final count. The army could think in pounds and calories. The cook thought about flour, ovens, kettles, and whether the meal would be ready when the line began to move. The man holding the tray had a simpler question. Would it be enough? Breakfast became plainer as the war went on. Bacon, eggs, fried potatoes, and French toast gave way to cereal, fruit, bread, jelly, and coffee. Beef appeared less often. German cooks worked with sausage, cheese, potatoes, cabbage, sauerkraut, bread, and smaller pieces of meat. Having prisoners in the kitchen made a difference. A German baker knew the bread other Germans missed. A German cook knew how far cabbage and potatoes could be made to stretch. At Camp Indianola in Nebraska, prisoners disliked the soft mess hall bread. Bakers among them were given flour, and they made the kind of bread the men preferred. It was a small change. The men still stood in line inside a guarded compound, and the loaf on the table did not bring anyone closer to home. But familiar bread made the meal feel less foreign. That matters more than it may sound. A man can become tired of a room, a fence, and a routine. Taste is one of the few things that can carry him somewhere else for a moment. Good food did not remove the wire. Sometimes it simply made the wire easier to bear. Now let me show you the day I promised. At Camp Fabens on April 14, 1945, breakfast was milk, cornflakes, coffee, and bread. At midday, the men received eggs, liver sausage, soup, tomato salad, and tea. Dinner brought meatballs, potatoes, cabbage, fruit, and coffee. That was a substantial day of food for wartime, especially when civilians across Europe were living among ruined cities and severe shortages. Yet listen to the meal again and the pattern becomes plain. Cereal, bread, soup, potatoes, cabbage, coffee, and measured portions of meat. Other camps changed the details. One kitchen served bologna where another served sausage. One had fresh vegetables from a nearby farm, while another relied on tins and whatever came off the supply truck. But the same plain foods returned again and again because they could be bought in bulk and cooked for hundreds of men. There was no choosing from a long menu. If liver sausage had been prepared, liver sausage was what the serving line passed to you. If breakfast was bread and coffee, there were no eggs waiting at the far end. Picture the room at mealtime. Metal cups and trays touched the tables while steam rose from the kettles. Men moved past the ladle and returned to the same benches, beside the same faces, under the eyes of the guards. The meal might be good, but the room was still a prison mess hall. George Kellerman understood that difference. At Camp Huntsville in Texas, he wrote that the American food was very good. What he missed was the dark bread of Germany. The camp served soft wheat bread instead. And after praising the meals, he returned to one plain truth. It was still very hard to be a prisoner. That is the part worth remembering. A full tray could answer hunger. It could not answer homesickness, and it could not give a man back his freedom. The mess hall was only one part of the food story. A prisoner who worked received coupons rather than American cash. A normal workday earned 80 cents, and inside the camp those coupons bought the little things that made one week feel different from another. A man might buy soap or shaving supplies. He might choose candy, cigarettes, or a cold drink. Some canteens sold beer or low-alcohol wine, though many did not, and the rules became tighter later in the war. The important thing was not the candy itself, it was the choosing. Almost everything in a prisoner's day had already been decided. When he woke, when he stood for roll call, where he worked, when he returned, and what the ladle placed on his tray. Spending a few coupons gave him one small decision of his own. Gardens also became part of camp life. Prisoners grew cabbage, beans, tomatoes, and other vegetables that found their way into the kitchen. The work filled empty hours and helped supply the mess halls. There was a catch. Food grown inside the camp was counted against what the army otherwise had to provide. The vegetables filled the kettles, but they also saved the government food and money. And food followed the work. A man cutting timber or harvesting crops needed more than a man who remained inside the compound. Farmers wanted strong workers. Commanders wanted quiet camps. The prisoner wanted enough on his plate to carry him through the next day. For a while, that arrangement held together. Then people outside the fence decided the prisoners were receiving too much. American families had reasons to be angry. Sugar and meat were limited, butter could be hard to find, and families saved kitchen fat and grew vegetables at home. Newspapers carried stories about enemy prisoners eating food that ordinary Americans could not buy. Some of those stories made an occasional treat sound like an everyday feast. A birthday cake became proof that every prisoner was living well. A photograph of healthy men became proof that the camps were too generous. The anger reached the kitchens. By early 1945, pastries disappeared. Food could no longer be carried out of the mess hall. Meat portions became smaller, and eggs were counted against the meat allowance. Canned fruit, jam, and jelly were removed. Less popular cuts appeared more often: organ meat, salted fish, cold cuts, and pig's feet. The daily allowance for a working prisoner fell by about 500 calories. Men who stayed inside the compound received less, and when another reduction was proposed, the Army's own doctors refused to accept it. Here is what changed when the numbers on paper reached the men. Farmers began complaining that some prisoners were too weak to give a full day's work. At Camp Walters in Texas, prisoners sat down and refused to work. A system once troubled by wasted food and weight gain was now producing complaints about weakness and hunger. Kurt Vordermeyer, a Luftwaffe prisoner held in several Texas camps, remembered the change plainly. The food had been very good until the war ended. Then the prisoners were cut back severely. The plate had become a message. Earlier in the war, cream saved for a birthday cake could make America seem like a land of abundance. Later, a smaller portion told the same men that patience outside the wire had run thin. Conditions had changed, and a prisoner could see the change before anyone explained it to him. He could see it on his tray. So, did German prisoners eat better than American families? Sometimes they received more than Americans believed an enemy prisoner deserved. In some early camps, the food was plentiful enough for men to gain weight and waste what they did not recognize. But they did not spend the war eating steak, ice cream, and overflowing plates. Most days were built around bread, coffee, potatoes, cabbage, cereal, soup, and modest portions of meat. Prisoner cooks adjusted American ingredients to German habits, and working men could use coupons for small comforts. Camp gardens added vegetables, but the portions still changed as public anger grew and the war drew to an end. There was no single meal shared by every German prisoner in America. The camp, the date, the work, the cook, and the supply truck all mattered, and none of it made captivity pleasant. A man could be thankful for bread and still ache for home. He could enjoy hot coffee and still count the days behind wire. He could praise the food and, in the next breath, tell you how hard it was to remain a prisoner. Good food did not remove the wire. When I think about my father in America, I do not picture a banquet. I picture a place in a serving line, a metal cup on a table, and a meal eaten at an hour chosen by someone else. Some weeks the food was plentiful, and on some days it was unfamiliar. Later, the portions became smaller. Through all of it, men tried to turn flour, cabbage, potatoes, and a little meat into something that tasted less like captivity. And perhaps that is why Karl Hans remembered the chicken and ice cream. He remembered it because it was unusual. It was one meal freely requested and kindly given at the end of a work assignment. For a short while, the prisoners were asked what they wanted, and someone listened. The ordinary meals tell us how the camps worked. That final meal tells us what choice meant to a man who had almost none. The truth is quieter than the legend, and far more human.